Hi, welcome back. In this segment, we are going to be looking at some of the critiques of this very important concept of Americanization that we covered in the previous segment. So, the way in which the definition of Americanization has been built up, it seems as if there is a very forceful sort of influence that America exerts over the rest of the world in terms of politics or economics or culture and so on and so forth. Now, the sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein, in fact, challenged the idea of Americanization by pointing out that while the United States was certainly very influential at one point in time, today that the peak of its influence is over. So the perception that this concept of Americanization, that this concept creates, is certainly something that he challenges. Incidentally, Immanuel Wallerstein belongs to the world systems perspective group of scholars, and if you recollect, we covered that in the a few segments back. Okay, so taking a look at other critiques. Another sort of critique is launched at the significance that is given to the United States. I mean, one of the reasons why people talk about Americanization is also because of the influence that the American government had in various parts of the world. Okay, I think if we look at it today, even today, we will find that it is influential. But the challenge that is posed to the idea of Americanization is that, in fact, according to these people, the power that governments, that national governments used to hold, let's say in the 50s or 60s, is just not the same as their influence today. Now, I don't know if you are completely, in agreement on this, but certainly, we can be aware that this is one way in which criticism is posed against the idea that there is this very influential process of Americanization going on, behind which there is the sort of extreme influence of the American government. Another way in which the process of Americanization is challenged is that of indigenous Americanization. By indigenous Americanization, scholars usually mean that, very often when the process of Americanization is invoked, there is this perception that is created that Americanization is this kind of forceful push that is coming from the United States to the rest of the world. But many scholars argue that actually it's not as if people are being forced to adopt these cultural or economic or political changes. Very often, particularly in the cultural sphere, people themselves want to adopt these changes. Okay, I thought of a very hilarious example of this, which comes to us from Pakistan. Actually, you can see on the slide there is an image of a makalu tikki. Now, this is a very specific type of McDonald's burger. And the company of McDonald's, of course, is very much associated with the United States. What is special about this burger is that the filling, it has a potato tikki. And you will see that, this is actually, if you look at kind of what are the sales of different types of burgers in India and also in Pakistan, this is a very popular type of tikki, of burger. Now, it's very amusing that actually in Pakistan there is this person who set up a stall. He was a burger and tikki seller. Okay, so it's very common actually in many parts of North India, for instance, for this kind of bun and aloo tikki concept, right, as a popular street food. So what this guy did was he went one step forward, and in order to make his shop popular or his thela popular, he sort of marketed himself as McDonald's, right? So you're getting the McDonald's burger here. So as humorous as this example is, it certainly tells us that um, the kinds of flows that are being referred to as Americanization actually include very complex processes. And sometimes there is force involved, sometimes there is a lot of desire involved as well, and we should always keep that in mind when we are studying these processes. We will take a closer look at it, particularly in the chapter on culture and globalization. Okay, so another critique that is leveled against the concept of Americanization, challenging the significance of the process of Americanization, is that it underestimates the nature of the flows that exist in the world today. So the concept of Americanization, particularly the way in which its detractors or people who dislike what they see as the process of Americanization, they make it seem as if it's this all-pervasive, very very strong and crushing influence that the United States has, and it's pretty much a one-way flow, right? So from the United States to the rest of the world. However, many people argue that what we see in as part of a contemporary global world is that there are two-way flows, right? So as much as there are flows coming from the US to the rest of the world, there are flows going from the rest of the world to India, to America. Sorry, I said India because I was actually thinking of the popularity of yoga studios in the United States. They became, in at least some major cities, yoga became very sort of fashionable for people to do. So that's why I was thinking of yoga in India and these two-way flows. The other critique that is often lodged against Americanization is that often there are flows that occur between different parts of the non West or non America itself, right? So, as an example of this, actually, I included two posters. The first is the poster of the Korean film not Old Boy, Old Boy from 2003. It was a very popular film, and very soon, an unauthorized Indian remake of it was made in the form of Zinda. So a Hindi film was based. So if we were only looking at Americanization, we would expect that, okay, Bollywood is going to only do remakes of Hollywood films. But of course, Bollywood being Bollywood seems to be doing very democratically remakes of films from across the world. Okay, so these are just some sort of arguments that are used to question whether the process of Americanization is really as influential as people make it out to be. Now, in this very line of argumentation, I think we can also take a look at the concept of Easternization. So, we discussed Westernization, we discussed Americanization, where it was, the power, influence, cultural, economic, political that is coming from the West or from the United States to the rest of the world. But Campbell in 2007 said that today we live in such a global world that we can very clearly see that there is also the other kind of flow which is happening, which is the Easternization of the West. So there are influences from the eastern part of the world going to West, the West, by which he means Europe and the United States. So of course Campbell was talking about Easternization in the context of the growing influence of China at that point, right? So, therefore, he said that, look, China has become so influential today that instead of talking about Westernization, we should be talking about Easternization. But I would just like to point out to you that actually there is a much longer history of this kind of an acknowledgement. For instance, in the 1980s, or actually we should say since the 1980s onwards, even as Japan became an influential economic power and started to actually like companies like Toyota etc. started to set up production lines there, a very similar conversation was happening. So, for instance, the influence of Japan in terms of food, that's ramen in front of you, or in terms of management techniques. So, for instance, the just-in-time management technique, which was adopted at Toyota, and then from there in many American companies, right? Or the popularity of Japanese manga. All of these became kind of examples of Easternization of the West long before Campbell sort of developed the concept of Easternization of the West. In any case, I hope that all these different processes, you get a clear idea of the process itself and the way in which it is connected to globalization. But I also wanted to think about the ways in which actually these processes are different from globalization. What we see in all of these different processes is that they often refer to specific periods or events that have happened, but they cannot, they cannot explain by themselves the entirety of globalization. That I think would be a wise approach to take when looking at the differences between these processes and globalization.